Robert Greene, the author of the 48 Laws of Power, once said that mastery is not a function of genius or talent. It is a function of time and intense focus applied to a particular field of knowledge. And that sums up the Gripen perfectly. Today we're going to wrap up the Swedish trio and go off about the JAS-39 Gripen or Gripen, Sweden's most modern fighter jet and arguably a master of the 4th generation template. While aircraft generations are difficult to distinguish and often vary based on whether your country lives in its own little world or the actual one, a 4th generation aircraft is usually distinguished by high agility and or fly-by-wire controls, advanced radars and missiles that can strike above, below, and beyond the horizon, and starter steps into more data-fused and user-friendly operations that sometimes step into the realm of newer generations. Rather than being groundbreaking, these designs focus on refining the decades of aerodynamic and technological research that came before them. And while the Gripen was one of the last planes to make it to that 4th generation party, both Sweden and the world would find out that despite being as small and awkward as the shy kid in the corner, this kid could absolutely show up and get down with the combat business. The Flygvapnet, aka the Swedish Air Force, had started making the Viggen to replace the Draken before the Draken even left the drawing board. And that worked out pretty well, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and the Swedes started looking into what would come after Thor's Thunderduck right after it entered service in the early 1970s. To start, they already knew they should improve on the Viggen's formula, that being effective, cheap, and fitted to their base 90 setup. You know, that series of road runways Sweden has so that if anybody blows up the actual runway, they can still jump out from the ground and yell, "Surprise, mother..." before administering the enemy their unscheduled missile prostate exams. At first, Saab was only looking at replacing the attack Viggens and began looking into a new high subsonic attack jet called the B3LA or the A38. However, over the next several years of work, it became clear that fighter jets capable of multiple missions or multi-role aircraft would take the lead role on any future combat stage, and the B3LA, being designed specifically for ground attack, wouldn't be able to evolve enough later to do that multi-role job.
So I scrapped it.
The Flygvapnet threw it away and started reworking the requirements from the ground up to see what they'd need in this new multi-role fighter concept. Same idea as before, effective, cheap, and floor is lava, but this time with some more horsepower and gunpowder. While this was going on, the F-16 and FA-18 programs were also coming to fruition across the pond, and whether it was the cooperation between Sweden and America over time or internal politics pushing to save money, the Flygvapnet did consider buying those instead for a little while. Problem was, Sweden also had a homegrown air defense network with a lot of custom parts. They had custom data links, custom command networks, custom radio frequencies, and custom hardware for all of that, and nobody knew how much it would cost or how long it would take to fit all that stuff into these small and tightly packed American jets. Simply put, the A-38 wasn't flexible enough and the American planes weren't Viking enough, so the Swedes figured it'd be easier to just IKEA themselves a new plane from scratch and officially shelve the old project in February 1979.
Who wants to be king?
The same month, they would turn left and start making a new plane based on lightweight fighter research they'd been cooking up in the background. And in almost perfect sync, the Flygvapnet finished fixing the requirements, submitted them to the Swedish Defense Materiel Administration or FMV, and let Jesus take the wheel from there. In 1980, the FMV issued a requirement to Swedish manufacturers for a next-generation combat aircraft referred to as the JAS, or JAS, which stood for Jakt, Attack, and Spanning, or in English, Fighter, Attack, and Reconnaissance. As the requirement name implied, this plane would have to fly pretty much whatever mission the Swedes wanted it to, all while being good enough to keep the Soviets out and cheap enough to keep the taxpayers happy. It's like the car maintenance triangle of good, cheap, and fast, except the Flygvapnet's about to have the audacity to choose all three.
Watch this.
A maneuver a day keeps the Soviets away, so this new plane would have to be fast and agile enough to keep the newest MiGs and Sukhois on their toes. But while good commanders think tactics, great commanders think logistics, and the Swedes wanted that nailed down from the beginning. The JAS had to be simpler and cheaper to fix than the Viggen, which was already a maintenance gold standard. Then it had to be fast to reload, refuel, and relaunch to keep downtime to a minimum and platform to playground conversions to a maximum, and be able to take off and land from their road runways. The only thing they didn't really ask for was a long flight range, because the Swedes didn't expect this plane to go anywhere past their own borders. And in response to this requirement, the entire Swedish defense industry teamed up. Rather than having one company as the main designer with with a bunch of subcontractors, Saab Scania, Volvo Flugmotor, Ericsson, and Furenata Fabrikswerken would form a consortium called Industry Gripen JAS, giving all of them a stake in the success or failure of the project, presumably with Saab elected as the consortium's leading company. A guess I make based on the fact that they agreed to use Saab's name when the Swedish military version of the Boys submitted their proposal called the Saab 2110, which was accepted in the spring of 1982.
Daddy's home.
By June, the Flygvapnet had signed an initial production contract for 5 updated prototypes and 30 production units. On top of that, the Swedes left the door open for another 110 aircraft and originally hoped to pick up a grand total fleet of 304, which was officially named the Gripen by way of popular vote. Because unlike Bodie McBoatface, the Swedes actually know how to give their stuff cool names. While that was happening, Saab fitted an electronic control system to a Viggen and flew it to test the planned fly-by-wire control system. The Gripen's first prototype started being assembled in 1984 and the full-size mock-up was completed in 1986. But now the Gripen program was starting to face a new issue in Swedish aviation: public pressure. See, Saab's development was not going as flawlessly as it had for previous jets, and mounting cost increases, technical problems, and schedule delays was giving political opponents interested in putting that money towards other things enough ground to try pushing for the program to be cancelled in favor of a foreign alternative. The Gripen was starting to look like the underdog on its own front lawn, and if it didn't make some headway soon, the Swedish people were going to cancel it outright.
I can't hear you.
But Saab couldn't hear the critics over the sound of burning jet fuel, and on December 9, 1988, neither could the test pilot as the first Gripen prototype took to the skies. The first few tests from this plane were convincing enough for Saab to start making the 2-seat JAS-39B trainer, but those victories were short-lived. On February 2, 1989, the first Gripen prototype was landing from one of its test flights when the flight control system glitched. The pilot's attempt to correct for the sudden change in flight control properties caused a very short cycle of correcting and recorrecting called a pilot-induced oscillation, or PIO, causing the Gripen to impact the ground. The first hit broke the nose and the left wing and landing gear, dragging it down briefly before the engine picked back up and turned the plane into a rolling ball of fiery wreckage. Unfortunately for the Swedes, this event was being filmed live, and while the pilot did survive with burns and a broken arm, it no doubt reignited the fires of the press against the Gripen on top of it. Rooting out the glitch pushed the development schedule back even more, and the next prototype wouldn't fly until the 4th of May the next year. By June of 1992, the majority of those bugs had been ironed out though, and the aircraft was already exceeding the Flygvapnet's expectations.
I like it. I like it. I like it.
The Swedish government would both approve the B model's construction and officially order the extra 110 Gripens from before. However, these 96 Gripen A's and 14 Gripen B's wouldn't be the same as the first 30, with the first group labeled Batch 1 and the other 110 built to an improved standard called the Batch 2. But the prototypes weren't done showing off yet, and 2 of them would introduce themselves to the world the right way in September of 1992 at the Farnborough Air Show, only relinquishing the reins to the production model on its first flight on August 4th, 1993. And the production model would follow up by dropping the ball in yet another filmed accident, this time during an air show in Sweden with the same pilot at the controls as the first time. And guess what? It was also due to a glitch in the flight control system. Thankfully, he managed to eject this time around without injury, but the Gripen was definitely giving this man PTSD by now.
No, anything but that.
This probably spun up the critics yet again, and the entire Gripen fleet was grounded until they could root out the bug. That was the last of the high-profile technical issues, though, and the Gripen A was up to initial operating capability by 1995. But the blows to the program just kept coming, because at about this time, the Soviet Union, whose collapse had been the background music track to this entire process, was now definitely dead, and post-Cold War budgets were pretty much set in stone with the end of the symphony. As a result, the Swedish government felt there was less need for military might and started downsizing from their planned fleet total of 350 Gripens. As a result, when the first Batch 2 Gripen was delivered in December 1996, the Swedes would only order 64 of the newest Batch 3 machines, better known as the 50 single-seat JAS-39Cs and the 14 twin-seat JAS-39Ds. And by 1997, the JAS-39A was declared fully operational in all its capabilities and became the first member of the soon-to-be European Delta Trio. It also came with the least swept wings and foreplanes at a fairly standard 45 degrees. Just like with the Viggen, this plane featured the same close-coupled canard delta setup that took the wingtip vortices you get when a plane decides to lift and spins them over the wings to lower the air pressure and make more lift. Lift is air pressure on the bottom minus air pressure on top, and air pressure on a wing gets lower the faster the air moves. So logically, if you take a miniature tornado and shove it over the top of the wing, your pressure on top is going to drop like you just finished. The Gripen also took its aerodynamic dominance notes on the sawtooth edge stuck to the front, which makes that same mini NATO in a turn help it keep up the roll rate when it needs to roll in with enough explosives to make somebody take their hill with them. Add that to the twin elevons that drop like flaps when it's time to stop playing the floor as lava, and that about wraps up the list of similarities because that's where the Gripen stops acting like a student.
When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master.
For starters, you might have noticed that the Gripen has two wingtip missile rails that the Viggen doesn't. This changes the official name of the wing shape from a delta wing to a cropped delta wing, which takes those tiny dustless devils made by the actual wing and spreads them out a little, making them slow your roll even less. Think of it like pulling your arms in a little bit before spinning around in a circle, makes it a bit easier. And then the tiny little ridges on the nose would make another vortex for more control and hard turns. Seriously, if this plane was built in America, the pilots would call it Tornado Alley with how much it relies on frickin' weather phenomena to go places. Also, while the Viggen's canards were fully fixed, the Gripen's foreplanes were fully not, meaning that while the Viggen could only use the forward whirlwinds at one set of speeds, the Gripen could use them to boost its lifting personal record at any speed and any time. They're like steroids with no drawback. Well, one drawback. The only reason they couldn't do that sooner was that this design was incredibly unstable in flight, and Swedish computers hadn't caught up enough to make a good fly-by-wire system to compensate. But when they did, they let the Gripen setup pull off some wild techniques, like adapting their control outputs to battle damage. Yes, you heard me correctly, that triple redundant set of wires can let you fly home while pretending that one of your control surfaces didn't just get shot off. It can also deflect the foreplanes almost 90 degrees to act as air brakes on landing, meaning that while the Gripen may not have a thrust reverser like the Thunderquack does, when combined with all the other braking features, pilots have performed simulated landings on carrier decks without using arresting gear.
Observe.
Part of that is also helped by the aircraft's insanely light weight, which relied on a metric ton of composites to make something that weighed half as much as a Viggen with nothing in it and 3/4 the weight of an F-16. With nothing on board, no gas, no explosives, no nothing, the Gripen clocked in at a mere 14,600 pounds or 6.6 thousand knot pounds. But the Swedish engineers decided that when it was time for a night on the town, the Gripen's catchphrase was going to be
Double it!
because the Gripen can step into the ring weighing in at up to 27,500 pounds or almost 12,500 kilos, literally running off to ruin somebody's day with a second Gripen's worth of bombs and gas slung up underneath. This thing ain't here to play. Doesn't matter if it's using its license-built Mauser BK-27 27mm cannon with 120 rounds, or the 8 hardpoints carrying its various assortments of explosive ass probes. Some of these hardpoints were more dedicated, such as the wingtip missile rails, the centerline rail, which usually mounted a 290-gallon or 1,100-liter gas tank, and the intake rail for a targeting pod. But the 4 underwing points prefer to believe that variety is the spice of life, and could either mount 2 more fuel tanks or cover air, land, and sea. Originally, the air-to-air implement of choice was the same hot-potatoed RB-71 license-built Skyflash missiles. But once they were ready, the Gripen would change its primaries to the American AIM-120 AMRAAM, built under license with slight Swedish tweaks as the RB-99. If grid coordinates needed to disappear, the Gripen could fly out with RB-75 license-built American AGM-65 Maverick missiles, the BK Mjolnir submunitions dispenser, and various dumb bombs and rockets. But if you were looking at a pesky ship in your waters, then the best weapon of choice was the RBS-15 sea-skimming anti-ship missile, later versions of which could hang your soul in 1 or 2 lanterns before it pounds you by land or by sea. Plus, when you drop it all and come back, the plane can be reloaded, refueled, and sent back into the air in as little as 10 minutes. However, the Gripen's main game isn't offense, but defense, because its electronic warfare suite is the shit. that. Those wingtip missile rails aren't just missile rails, they're also long enough to hide the radar warning receivers. And when the Gripen's packing AMRAAMs or Sidewinders, the underwing hardpoints can fit another neat Swedish invention, the BOL sticks. These things can each fit 160 units of chaff or flares, meaning that the missile's gonna have a real fun time figuring out where it isn't when the Gripen turns itself into a damn wood chipper for radar signals.
Good luck getting a lock on my F-16 when I have more flares to pop than a Chinese firework factory.
Even if it isn't carrying air-to-air weapons to throw the BOL sticks under, the Gripen still carries 80 big countermeasure spewers in the fuselage and a towed decoy in each wingtip. When deployed, those decoys will either jam the missile's launcher or the missile itself, and if all else fails, its last mission is to pull a get down Mr. President and draw the missile to itself in a process known as seduction. And the fact that you can yeet those things out the back of the plane while going faster than sound really brings a whole new definition to speed dating. In fact, this entire plane is a flying heartbreaker because the PS-05A radar could put out 3 times the power of its predecessor and track up to 10 targets at once in the air or on the ground, while being only 60% of the weight. Meaning that it has enough power and tracking ability to find and fuck anything that moves and a lot of what doesn't, while having more than enough protection to escape all of the consequences.
Breaks hearts, she will break yours.
That tracking data could also be sent to other Gripens by way of the Tactical Information Data Link System, a high-bandwidth, highly jamming-resistant radio data link with a range of 310 miles or 500 kilometers. Meaning that if the enemy isn't paying attention, the Gripen can play the world's deadliest game of peekaboo. However, past this point, the JAS Industry Group decided to rely much more heavily on American hardware. In fact, across its lifespan to date, nearly 3/4 of the Gripen's avionics have been imported American systems or license-built American parts. It's the first Swedish aircraft to have a foreign ejection seat, the Batch 2 Gripens replaced their flight control computer with one made by Lockheed, and 60% of its Volvo Aero RM12 turbofan engine is built by General Electric and shipped there. In the engine's case, though, that's because the RM12 was jointly developed by Volvo and GE using the legacy Hornet's F404 engine as a base. The Swedes basically took the existing engine and gave it a Swedish afterburner and a larger and domestically produced bypass fan on the front. This new fan made the engine better at telling any bird stupid enough to get in its flight path, "You might not stop me, but I will definitely stop you," and gave the Swedish engine a 10% increase in airflow, which translates to a roughly 2% improvement to both total thrust and fuel economy. On the stat card, that means the Gripen puts out 12,180 pounds or 54 delete newtons of thrust without afterburner, 18,100 pounds or 80.5 delete newtons with afterburner, and a top speed of Mach 1.4 on the deck and Mach 2 near its max altitude. However, even with the improved fuel economy, it's more than 5,300 pounds or 2,400 kilos of gas could only get the aircraft out to a combat radius of 500 miles or 800 metric knot miles, or a max of 1,860 miles or 3,000 kilometers for a one-way trip. Remember, it wasn't expected to go anywhere past their own borders, so that was no issue for the Flygvapnet, and Sweden's logistics design was on point as usual. The Gripen's engine could be started on its own with a second separate mini-jet engine called an auxiliary power unit and be changed in the field in just 1 hour, using as few as 5 untrained people with 1 supervisor. And all of that is just the A variant. One of the Batch 1As was modified on the production line into the first JAS-39B. The second seat stretched the plane by another 2 feet 2 inches, which saved it from losing much, if any, of the onboard fuel. In fact, the only thing they really gave up was the onboard gun, because the Gripen was already so pilot-friendly and easy to adapt to that conversion training was basically unnecessary. And as a result, the plane was kept as combat-capable as possible for tactical training purposes. All 14 planned Gripen Bs were built in Batch 2 along with the 96 Gripen As, but the Batch 1 deal was cut short to 6 Gripen As instead of the planned 30. And that candle got burned at both ends, because the last 20 Gripen As weren't even pure As, because they were built using features from the next models, the Gripen Cs and Ds. And the new models had a big focus: NATO compatibility. With the Soviets definitely dead now, not only were they not worried about their brother Finland being taken hostage, but the only major military alliance left in Sweden's ballpark was NATO. And with their history of quietly cooperating with America and other European nations, they weren't exactly planning on staying outside. This massive shift in the number of friends also meant that Swedish aircraft needed new systems to keep pace with not only NATO operations, but the export market as well. The cut down of the Batch 1 deal and Swedish defense budget support on the decline meant that Saab would have to look elsewhere if it wanted to make up for lost profits. And the resulting overall improvements to the Cs and Ds to compensate was such a large leap forward that they were sometimes called the Super Gripens. Aside from in-flight refueling and NATO compatibility, these new Gripens would also get access to the Link 16 data link system and GPS. You're not going to mystify the enemy with the same old tricks forever, and more is better, so to keep their options as open as possible, Saab strengthened the airframe to carry heavier bombs. This increased the empty weight slightly, but in exchange it boosted the payload mass up to 12,300 pounds or 5,600 kilos, and let the plane abandon the planet's surface with a little more than its own weight in gas and bombs. They also increased the variety of weapons compatibility, and where there's GPS, there's JDAMs, and the Gripen C would pick up every size of those with or without the range-extending glide kits. But America isn't the only country making weapons in NATO, or in the world for that matter, and the Gripen C would become the missile version of a librarian, because it would catalog pretty much every missile in the West and beyond. For starters, they would almost immediately adopt the new French Mica missiles, and as much as some of us Americans like to rag on the French, I need all us to pause for just a moment here. The Mica might not be the longest range missile out there, but when it comes to its tracking quality, it is easily one of the best. If you're flying a plane and you get a Mica missile shot at you within the range it can cover with its motor burning, don't run, you will only die tired. It will catch you.
It was like they yoinked your IP address because they track your every move and there is no escape.
They also started moving away from the Sidewinder series when the German Iris-T heat-seeking missile came out, testing it for the first time on November 7, 2006. By 2010, it was in full service and replaced the American license-built AIM-9L and AIM-9M Sidewinders, which had been built under license as the RB-74 and RB-74M respectively. And they came with the Cobra helmet-mounted sight to give every pilot a gaze that literally melts metal. Foreign Gripens would also pick up other missiles like the Israeli Derby and Python missiles or the South African R-Darters and A-Darters. And in 2016, the Gripen would receive the ramjet-powered European Meteor missile for hitting things like a meteor at long range. But it wasn't just the hardware that got some upgrades. After all, the weapons mean nothing without the machine to get them there. New targeting pods and a better electronic warfare suite helped augment the offense and defense of the Gripen C, and the thing can apparently generate its own oxygen supply like it's supposed to run in Then there were the full-color displays and night vision, plus the improved RM-12UP jet engine with fully digital engine control, enabling the aircraft to get the absolute most out of its propulsion. The twin-seat D model was pretty much the same, with the exception of, yet again, a second person and no gun. The C model entered Swedish service in 2005, but the Gripen's underdog nature would surface yet again 2 years later, with the Flygvapnet cutting their planned purchase of 204 Gripen Cs and Ds by just over half down to 101. The original purchase of 50 Cs and 14 Ds would be boosted by 31 upgraded A and B models, but the last of those wouldn't be delivered until 2015. Between that and the Batch 1 loss, it was clear that Sweden wasn't going to be as large a customer as Saab had hoped. If this plane was going to stay in the world as long as planned, they were going to have to look elsewhere. But export sales would be their own beast to tackle because the Swedes hadn't exported a fighter since the 1960s era Draken. Not to mention, their first production model had crashed all the way back at its first public air show in Sweden in 1993, so Saab had about as much marketing leverage on the export system as a toddler pushing a boulder.
That whale's not going anywhere.
So in 1995, before the C and D models were even ready, Saab turned to BAE Systems to form a partnership called Gripen International, where Saab would make the planes and BAE Systems would make the phone calls. But there was still a lot of doubt that Sweden would be able to nab any sizable slice of the export pie from the most dominant exporters in the Western world, the United States and France. Many of Sweden's northern European neighbors and much of the Middle East had been won over by the F-16 already, while a massive total of South American, African, European, and Southeast Asian nations had bought into the Mirage family. Even with the British marketing behind it, the Gripen would once again be the underdog, this time in its fight to populate across the world's forces. However, nothing feels better than everybody telling you it's not possible and then doing it anyway, and that's what the Gripen's been doing this entire time. It won this fight on its home turf once, it can do it again anywhere else, and everyone's about to figure that out. South Africa would be the first customer after the Gripen won a relatively uncontested bid in 1999, ordering 28 C and D Gripens before they were even developed. As a result, they wouldn't get their Gripens until the spring of 2008, and by then they seemed to have confused how magical the aircraft looks on paper with the idea that it ran on Magic 2, because for whatever reason they just didn't maintain them, and now the entire fleet is grounded.
Congratulations, You played yourself.
2 aircraft were restored to flight readiness in 2022, but that's about it so far. The next buyer to have their number called was Hungary, with the Czech Republic following close behind. These bids were a lot more competitive, and the thing that probably sealed the deal was that both nations were allowed to not outright buy them, because apparently Sweden is one of the only nations I've seen that will make you a loan of fighter jets. Hungary would choose to sign a 10-year lease for 14 used A and B Gripens upgraded to a near CD standard, becoming the first major export victory for the Gripen. These got sent out between 2006 and 2007 and have had their lease extended twice since. Hungary bought 4 more Cs outright in 2025, and their leased Gripens are getting a life extension and modernization package as we speak. The Czech deal, which was to originally buy those last 20 almost CD Gripen A's and B's outright, would be a bit more delayed, because in 2002 the country got hit with the worst flooding in recent Central European history, leaving multiple governments literally drowning in figuring out their emergency procedures. The Czech government would follow up in December 2003 by cutting a lease deal with Sweden for 14 of those planes, 12 A's and 2 B's. Those were sent over in 2005, and the lease deal has been extended twice now, with modernization starting in 2016. These successes were major victories for Saab in more ways than one, because they had earned the Swedish tech titan enough international recognition to really stand on their own 2 feet, which was perfect timing because BAE had been trying to get its mitts into Saab's movement since 1998 when it bought 35% of the company. But you know Swedish engineering, doesn't matter if it's cheap furniture for you to assemble or cheap fighter jets to disassemble you, they know what they're doing, and thanks to the Gripen, Saab no longer needed to hand over that much corporate control. So in 2005, Saab would take back ownership of the marketing department and leave BAE back to their own devices.
Good. That's one less loose end.
The next customer to buy in was Thailand, ordering 6 CD Gripens in 2007, 6 more in 2008, and another 6 in 2010. Their orders were the first to hold a steady pace from purchase to service, with the first flight in 2009, delivery starting in 2011, and the third batch delivered in 2013. While all the Gripen Cs had come with their own modifications, the Thai ones were somewhat special, as their order would come with the lantern-hanging anti-ship missiles and Thailand's own data link system, the Link T. And while that was happening, the Gripen would finally get to stretch its war legs. A little bit. In 2011, 8 Gripens were deployed to Sicily to fly recon and help enforce NATO's no-fly zone over Libya. Gaddafi stepped out of line and, well, he should have known better after the first time. This action was also historic for more than just the Gripen, because despite the fact that they didn't see any combat, the 650 missions the Gripens flew marked the first time any Flygvapnet aircraft had deployed to an international operation since the J-29 Tunans operations in Congo in 1961. And with that fresh deployment exercise under its belt and all these new export orders, Sweden now had a solid wealth of experience to design the version that's all the rage these days, the Gripen E. And if the CD models were called the Super Gripens, it kind of makes you wonder what they'd call this.
Then he must be a super duper Saiyan.
Truth be told, the Swedes had been preparing the more advanced version of the Gripen before their jet had even seen enemy skies. On May 28, 2008, a Swedish tech demonstrator flew that was called both the Gripen Demo and the Gripen NG, or Next Generation, but the program was later termed the Gripen E, with the twin seat naturally being called the Gripen F. Sweden would order 60 E's and F's in 2012, 5 years before the first prototype even saw the sky on June 15, 2017. The amount of faith Sweden has in their military-industrial complex is astonishing. The first production model took flight 2 years later on December 3rd, 2019, but the global shutdowns caused by that one plague that YouTube doesn't like to talk about caused a lot of delays in development and component deliveries, especially with the new engines. But even with these delays, by 2023, the aircraft was independently sized up as the cheapest modern fighter on the market in both total cost per flight hour and acquisition cost, even after including crew and maintenance. The only thing that came close was the F-16V, which actually rang in at $100,000 cheaper than the Gripen E. But $100,000 is mere pocket change in terms of fighter jets, and the total cost per flight hour was $3,000 more expensive than the Gripen E and F's $22,200. Sweden would finally get their first Gripen E on October 20th, 2025, and it may have been the same rough shape, but this was a completely different plane. Like I said before, the Swedes didn't expect this plane to go anywhere past their own borders, so when they started receiving a ton of export orders, one of the issues they ran into was that very lack of reach they had originally planned to do without. To fix this, Saab, in a brilliantly simple move, pushed the main landing gear outwards and made them fold forwards into these clean aerodynamic housings under the wings. This let them rework the structural layout along the bottom of the fuselage so it could act as a fuel tank with 35% more gas and fit 2 more weapons hardpoints onto the belly for a total of 10. That extra fuel nearly doubled the combat radius up to 930 miles or 1,500 kilometers and bolted 1,000 more kilometers or almost 700 more miles onto the max range. The additional fuel also increased the maximum takeoff weight to 16,500 kilos or just over 36,000 pounds. But despite that, they were still able to increase the payload weight to 6,000 kilos or just over 13,000 pounds, still able to carry an entire copy of its empty self. New hardpoints came with new weapons such as the AIM-9X Sidewinder and the European ASRAM, but most of what made the Gripen E so powerful was everything you weren't supposed to throw at the enemy. Radar-absorbent materials and shaping was applied where possible to the existing airframe to take its radar visibility down a notch, although it's not quite what you'd call a stealth plane. Which is fine because it wasn't meant to hide from the missiles, it was meant to electronically punch them in their eye socket.
Well, sucks to be you then.
Which it would do with multiple advancements, like a further improved electronic warfare and surveillance system, allowing it to collect, analyze, and counter radio frequencies in real time, new towed decoys, and a new jamming pod so it could also act as a jammer plane for surface-to-air missile sites. Helping that electronic suite even further was the new Celex ES-05 Raven AESA radar, which provided enough power and fidelity to actually use the maximum range of the Meteor missiles. And if it's fighting somebody stealthy, it can try and pick them out with the Celex ES Skyward G infrared search and track or IRST module on the nose to try and pick out targets by their heat signature. And speaking of heat, nothing's more effective at dodging a missile than good old flight performance, which the Gripen E adds to with that new engine we just mentioned, the F414G that Sweden borrowed from the Super Hornet. The new engine comes with 25% more thrust, marking it at 14,400 pounds or 64 kilonewtons dry and 22,000 pounds or 98 kilonewtons wet. And while the airframe is slightly slower with a top speed of Mach 1.9 at 50,000 feet, it can now super cruise at Mach 1.25. Oh, and it's got the Centaur AI agent made by the German company Helsing.
Hold on a minute. I gotta take this.
Then there's the gunless 2-seat Gripen F, but there's also another variant in the works based on the E model, the Gripen Maritime or Gripen M, which is a carrier-based Gripen and Sweden's first foray into true naval aviation. I'm guessing that somewhere along the line, Sweden remembered that they could technically land a Gripen on a carrier without arresting gear and said, I bet I could make that work better. And since not every air force in the world is here to play on hardcore mode, these would come with the equipment needed to take off with or without aircraft catapults and make arrested landings, also known as being Stobar and Catobar capable. The Gripen M will be trying out the usual suite of naval additions to a land-based plane, that being stronger landing gear, reinforced bulkheads, and all the standard nearly 1,000 pounds of changes. And while American design history would imply that this process isn't going to work, none of those planes can carry their own weight and gas and fire, so it
Might actually work.
Saab appears to be eyeing the possibility of selling to India and Brazil right now, but so far this model hasn't gone anywhere yet. The Gripen E's and F's, however, have, and 2 years after Sweden placed their order, Brazil put a contract in for 36 Gripen E and F's in 2014, also before the prototype had taken flight. Known in Brazil as the F-39E, this plane would come with a domestic production license and a tech exchange agreement, which let them get ahead of the curve and beat the originally expected first delivery date in 2026 by 4 years, making Brazil the actual first operator of the Gripen E anywhere in the world on December 19, 2022. As of August 2023, Brazil was seeking to acquire 34 more aircraft, but much like the Hungarian and Czech deals, the Brazilian Gripens are currently caught up in a scandal. From what I can gather, there appears to be several cases of suspected bribery, and in the Brazilian purchase specifically, 3 separate investigations have been conducted by Brazilian, Swedish, and now American Department of Justice prosecutors. However, the first 2 investigations by Brazil and Sweden found nothing wrong and out of the ordinary, which is the same result they got from the other 2 competitions, and at this point, I'm starting to suspect that the only thing that's really happening here is that so many people are surprised by the presence of this new sheriff in town who's running around taking defense contracts that even the people sending them can't figure out what the hell's happening.
Your Honor, I object!
And why is that, Mr. Reed?
Because it's devastating to my case!
Overruled.
Good call!
The Gripen is straight up turning into the John Wick of export deals, but even back home the aircraft wasn't done expanding. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Sweden started feeling like more firepower might be a good idea, and it was time to put on the old shirt and get back in the game. So on April 11, 2022, Saab was awarded a contract to upgrade 40 Gripen CDs to keep them relevant until 2035. And after joining NATO, they kicked that total up to 60, getting things like new weapons, updated engines and electronic warfare kits, and a better radar to let it look farther and start turning stealth into a buzzword. However, the confusing detail is that it's repeatedly reported that Sweden intends to apply this upgrade to its entire fleet for a grand total of 120 Gripens, despite the fact that the Swedes currently have 71 Cs and 23 Ds for a total of 94. So it sounds like Sweden is intending to retire 34 of these Gripens over the next few years, although they might not go to waste because it's possible that Thailand might buy some more after this. The Gripen wouldn't just be the only Flygvapnet plane deployed to a foreign theater since Congo. It would also become the first Swedish aircraft to see live combat since Congo. In July 2025, Thailand and Cambodia renewed their historical grudge match over a border dispute that they haven't been able to settle since their colonial days. The maps were shit and they can't figure them out with words, so someone's gonna have to bomb a line of craters in the ground and set it there, Grandpa Buff style. There's no clear indicator of who shot first either, and frankly, I don't think it would have mattered. The Gripens deployed there can't really rack up any air-to-air kills, though, because Cambodia doesn't have any fighter jets or attack jets. They have cargo planes, but last I checked, the only people crazy enough to weaponize those were America, because of course we are. So the only thing they've really been doing is conducting airstrikes. However, it appears so far that the Thai airstrikes have been mainly using their F-16s, with a very unique reason for it. I said earlier that great commanders think logistics, and this is one of those examples of what that looks like. From what I've been able to learn by word of mouth, it seems like the Thai weapon stocks have a lot of older 500-pound munitions in them, and they've been just getting rid of them in the same way that America's been giving their old stuff to Ukraine. And whether it's glide bombs, laser-guided bombs, or straight-up free-fall bombs, the F-16's hardpoint wiring and multiple ejector racks can carry 1.5 times as many bombs as the Gripen can. So while the Gripen may be the better and more modern plane, the F-16 is proving to be better for the task.
Details matter.
But the combat experience of delivering warheads precisely to the foreheads and dodging SAMs like the Matrix is still giving the jet plenty of street cred. Ukraine signed a letter of intent to buy anywhere between 100 and 150 Gripen EF jets on October 2025, though no orders have been placed yet. Colombia ordered 15 Gripen Es and 2 Fs on November 15, 2025, with delivery planned to start in 2026, and more export offers are being explored even as we speak, such as a possible interest by the Philippines. Thailand themselves signed an order back in August for 4 Gripen Es as well. But easily the biggest reason the Gripen is one of the hot topics of today is the renewed debate of it versus the F-35 for Canada. Now, I'm not going to tell Canada what plane to buy, that's their prerogative, but given the metric shit ton of information that just came out of this fire hose of a video, I feel like the biggest argument in favor of the Gripen is simply not well informed. The biggest talking point that I've seen in favor of the Gripen is the belief that it is independent of US trade restrictions. And the problem with that is because the Gripen doesn't exactly have a minimum amount of American tech in it. It uses an American jet engine, an American ejection seat, and several pieces of US avionics like that Lockheed flight computer. It's not like they couldn't find replacements. I mean, even for the engine, they could probably swap it out with the similarly sized Eurojet EJ200 from the Eurofighter. They would just be trading out lighter weight for lighter thrust. But the refit would take time, adding to the fact that even Sweden is just now getting their Gripen Es. And such replacements would be a requirement, because having any tech America deems sensitive gives it the grounds to block a foreign sale. And if America did do that for some reason, it wouldn't be the first time. In 2014, the US declassified a series of confidential memos outlining their decision to block Sweden from making what was looking like a promising sale of their AJ-37 Viggens to India in 1978 based on that exact line of reason.
Absolutely not.
The Gripen would need to have probably absolutely zero American tech in it to be completely clear of any trade restrictions. It's not impossible to give the Gripen such a green light, but if such a situation came to pass that it needed to fold that way, they probably wouldn't be ready when Canada needed them. But none of that is to say that the Gripen is an insufficient plane, and after doing all this research into the aircraft, I think I can finally understand why this plane has been so hyped up in recent years. Sure, there are limits to what it can do, but it does a lot with its little frame, and it will stop at nothing to make what it needs to do happen. It reminds me of how Eisenhower once said that it's not about the size of the dog in the fight, it's about the size of the fight in the dog. And if somebody can master the field of aircraft design to apply that philosophy to a fighter jet like the Gripen, you might be remiss to call it anything other than a work of art. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.